In this tutorial, I'll show you how to use the Skeleton Setup tab, one of the components of the figure setup tools for DAZ Studio, to change the skeleton of your figure. The things I demonstrate here can be repurposed in the case that you want to start from an existing figure and create a piece of conforming clothing for that figure. I'll start by selecting the figure, navigating to the Option menu for the Skeleton Setup tab, and choosing Copy from Selected Figure. In the OBJ Import Options dialog, I can choose the scale of my model and any options to change how DAZ Studio will read the geometry. I'm going to keep this at poser scale. Choose Accept, and in the Relationships list view, I see the bones that exist in this skeleton. I also see the geometry that's being used, as well as any IK chains that exist in the figure. I'm not going to be modifying the IK chain, so I'm going to go ahead and collapse this. If I look at the geometry item for the skeleton, I see that it's using the index 0, which tells me it's using the 0 index OBJ from the geometry list. If I expand the geometry for the bones, it's telling me the same thing. It's using the 0 index gills. To see the groups that exist in the geometry, I select that item in the geometry list, and the group list shows me those groups. I want to change the geometry that's being used in this figure, so I'm going to right-click in the geometry list, choose Add Geometry, and in the dialog that pops up, navigate to and select the geometry that I'd like to use in its place. Click Open, and I have OBJ Import Options for how I'd like to have DAZ Studio read the geometry that I just selected. I'm going to choose Poser Scale and click Accept. Notice now that I have another item in the geometry list with an ID of 1. If I select that item, I can see its groups. Notice in the group list, I have an extra group named Default. As I drag this item over to the geometry item for the skeleton, notice that it updates the references, pointing to the geometry that's being used. Also notice that it didn't create a new bone by the name of Default. When bones already exist in a figure, Skeleton Setup will not create new bones by dropping the geometry item on the skeleton's geometry. It will simply replace the reference for the geometry that's being used. If that geometry doesn't have a group that corresponds with the name of a bone, that geometry item will be cleared, but the bone will still exist. This effectively creates a ghost bone. I'll simulate a ghost bone by coming down to the geometry item for the head and removing its geometry reference. Since I'm modifying this figure, I'll go ahead and delete some of these bones to show that it can be done. Right-click, choose Remove Bone and Children, and now segment 10 is the last bone that will exist when I paste this back to the figure. I want to simulate a ghost bone with this one as well, so I'll clear its geometry reference. One thing to note here is if you look at the name of the skeleton, you can see it says Moray Eel 3 2962. 2962 is the vertex count for the Moray Eel 3 OBJ. I want that number to correspond with the high-res version of this geometry that I have here, and I want it to include the high-res name that I have. In order to do that, select on the skeleton item, right-click, and choose Edit Name. If I now type in the word figure, and then select and drag the geometry item onto the geometry item for that figure, you see that it has updated. Also notice that it added the geometry reference back to segment 10 that I had just removed. I'm going to go ahead and remove that again. I notice the geometry item for the head has also been changed. But instead of clearing that, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to use the group from the 0 geometry on this particular bone. So I go up and select that geometry item, click on the group, and drag that down to this geometry item. And notice that it's using the ID 0, while the others are using an ID of 1. This is a perfectly legal thing to do in DAZ Studio. Now that I'm done with the right side of this interface, I'll go ahead and click the toggle to collapse that, double-click the vertical bar to adjust the width, and I can see more information about my figure. For the purposes of this demo, say I want to unweld the head from the gills. To do that, select, right-click, and choose Weld to None. I could also change the name of a bone if I like. Let's change this to my head. Notice that the name of the label didn't change. You should note, by doing this, you would actually break compatibility with existing poses for the figure you started from, but I wanted to show that it was possible to do it. You could also change the rotation order for the bone, but in doing that, you would cause the parameters that are already built for this particular rig to be set back to their defaults, and you'd have to set those parameters up from the beginning. Leaving the rotation order as they are, you can at least start from those parameters and adjust them for the new geometry. I could also change the joint parameters that are currently created for this particular bone by unchecking these options, but I'm going to leave that alone. If I've done all the modifying to this figure's skeleton that I'm going to do, I simply navigate to the option menu for the skeleton setup tab and choose Paste to Selected Figure. And notice when I look at the model, the bones that I removed are gone. The geometry has been swapped out for the replacements that I made. And the geometry for the head is still using the previous geometry because I had assigned it to that one. This particular model wouldn't be of much use, but you can see how you can use this tool to create clothing items for existing figures quite rapidly.